The rookery of Dragonstone wept in the wind. Old rock caught the tide's breath and exhaled it back as a groan. And the sky past the arrow-slitted windows was a color that had not settled yet on day or night. The ravens stamped and muttered, black eyes reflecting coals. A lantern swung, painting the curve of the ceiling in amber sweeps. Someone had laid fresh rushes, and their scent could not lift the room from the sour tang of feathers and droppings and the sharp brine that came when the sea struck the cliff. Jon stood with his hands closed on the sill, listening to the birds. They were unsettled. He was unsettled, though his face did not show it. He had learned to stillness in cold places. When the door opened behind him and Ser Davos came in carrying a small iron-bound coffer with a chain wound thrice about it, the ravens in the nearest cote canted their heads toward the noise and hopped backwards, wings lifting and settling, even before the faint scraping within the coffer began. "They don't like it," Davos said unnecessarily. "Neither do I." Jon took the box anyway. It was cold against his palm, and he felt the shiver of something inside. Not heavy, but alive in the wrong way. He set it on the table between jars of ink and goose quills and the wax board used for tallying the birds that flew and the birds that failed to. Tyrion came in next, his breath quickened by the stiff stairs. Wind had blown his fair hair into a swirl. He had a folded parchment in one hand and, with the heel of the other, rubbed at the scar on his face as if it itched when the air turned damp. "Lord Snow," he said, as if he could pretend this was a council chamber rather than a place of droppings. "Your grisly guests disturb even men who pride themselves on having seen everything." Jon glanced at him. He did not see a man who had seen everything. He saw a man who had crawled through every fire he could find and survived. "You brought the lists?" "Varys did," Tyrion said. The spider slipped in after him like a rumor, pale hands drawn together in his sleeves. There were more Missandei because she insisted on hearing everything Daenerys might be asked to approve, and Grey Worm, silent as a shadow, though no one had asked him to come. Jorah Mormont, who seemed drawn to danger like a moth to lamp smoke, and the Maester of Dragonstone, thin and anxious, who blinked at the chain around the coffer as if wondering if it would climb, serpent smooth, and knot around his throat. They had all survived what Jon had brought back from beyond the wall. He did not know if that was mercy or mockery. "This is what we'll send," he said. "Pieces." Tyrion's lip curled, but his eyes were steady. "When I dreamed of diplomacy, it never involved severed hands." "You were born to a softer world than mine," Davos said. He set both palms flat on the table. "Either a lord believes a letter or he doesn't. But he'll believe a thing that moves. He'll believe when he cannot make himself not believe. Some will burn them unopened," Varys said, almost mild. "People burn what they fear and what they do not understand, often at once. But they'll tell the tale of what they burned. Fear has long legs." Jon undid the chain. Missandei flinched and caught herself. Jorah's knuckles whitened on the grip of his sword. The maester swallowed and held a brazier closer, though there was little warmth to be found from its coals. Jon pried free the lid. Within, packed in damp linen and what ice he had demanded from the kitchens, was a hand that was no longer a hand. The nails were black and split. The skin was a meat gray. It lay curled like a spider in death, and then, in the breath after airing, it clawed for the edge of the box and flung itself against the iron. The sound it made was too small to suit such horror. "Top! Top! Top!" The ravens answered in outrage, the chamber bursting into black thrum and wing. "Enough!" Missandei breathed. Tyrion took a step closer and took two back. It had not been so bad when the wight had come boiling out of the crate in a ruined courtyard miles from here. Something about the plain certainty of a thing that moved when it should not, on a table where one rested quills and seals, was blasphemy. "We've a finite supply of these," he said, humor as a blade. "Pieces. We have enough," Jon said. "Enough to send to every great house and every one of their bannermen who can read, and some who cannot. The words will go with the thing." "And to the citadel," Davos said. "For the men who did not believe a brother of the Night's Watch. Let them see this and say still that winter is only a season." Varys lowered his eyes. The Archmasters will not love the reminder. Their love isn't needed. Jon rewrapped the hand. Fought the cloth, he pressed harder. It was a ridiculous thing, wrestling in it, pressing cloth over fingers that clawed with no mind behind them. He and Davos refastened the chain, and as the lid closed, the room sighed. Daenerys wished to be here, Missandei said. She is with her dragons. The sound of the birds disturbed them. She will hear what was done and approve. There was a question in the last word. Jon did not belong to her and would not pretend to, but he had seen her across a wall of ice and flame, and he could not help but be moved by someone who tried. We will need her approval to use the rookery and the birds. They are hers. They are mine to command, Varys said, almost without inflection. I've sent messages from Dragonstone when kings lived here and when they did not. No one owns flight. Who writes the letters? Tyrion asked. I will, Jon said. You can write to the north, Tyrion said gently. To the Vale, maybe, but there are lords whose ears are stopped with gold and flattery. There are lords to whom a letter from you is a letter from a rebel and a bastard. There are lords who don't remember the wall being anything but a tale of their grandsires. Let me write them. Le. Teamy write Casterly Rock and the Reach, the Stormlands and the Islands. Let me speak to them the way we do, a way they will not throw in the fire before the seal is broken. Jon's mouth was an unhappy line. Then he nodded. We write together. That night, wind scraped the walls until the castle seemed to grind its teeth. The hall where they set the boxes was cold enough that their breaths began to show. Men from the kitchens brought the pieces of ice from smooth-worn tubs and set them into the lower spaces of the coffered bottoms. And then, with tongs, Jon and Davos and Yora and Grey Worm placed each moving thing into its new prison. This one a hand, that one a foot, toes wriggling as if they sought purchase. Here a jaw that clacked without sound against wood until Davos fitted a loop of chain through its hinge and made it still enough to seal. The candles guttered when the lid went down. Jon's fingers grew numb. He did not mind it. Men had bled under his hands. This was a lesser discomfort. They sealed each with wax and pressed the seal with 2 marks. One for the dragon and one for the wolf. Missandei kept the list, writing each name neat as sword strokes. Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor. Lady Lyanna Mormont of Bear Island. Lord Robert Glover. Lord Royce of the Vale on behalf of Lord Arryn. Lord Tarlys Castellan at Horn Hill. Whoever held power in Dorne. Whoever dared to call himself Lord in the Riverlands now that the twins stank of death. To Tarth. To Storm's End empty? The castle that needed a lord and had none. Yet men still looked to it, and letters still found their way to the rooms that were not abandoned no matter how the line had bent and broken. To King's Landing, to the maesters in Old Town, to the Lord Commander of the City Watch who would hate that his hands would have to touch whatever came when Cersei demanded to see it. Tyrion wrote his words by wine light. He crafted paragraphs that walked an old habit. Flattered a little, threatened not at all, pressed circumstance rather than will. There was no appeal to honor. Honor had done little for him in his life. He appealed to the land beneath their feet and the breath that steamed, and to children who did not go to sleep because the night creaked with wrongness. He wrote as if each lord and lady had sense tucked somewhere in the folds of their silks. Jon's words were fewer. He told the truth. He told what he had seen beyond the wall and under it, and what burned and what could not be driven off with sword or spear, and what he had loved and lost and what he wished to deny but could not. He did not name love. He spoke of vows instead because he understood those. When it was over, the birds took their burdens badly. They were trained to wait to the drag of a sealed tube. They were not trained to the rattle that came from the boxes tied under their bodies, or the cold that leaked from it, or the way the hunger that was not hunger stirred the air around them. Some fought out of their jesses and tore wild through the rookery, beaks striking the glass of the lantern. One burst toward a slit and battered itself against stone with such ferocity that Jon lunged and caught it, hissing, the hook of the beak scoring his palm as if the bird itself rejected the work. By dawn, they had enough flying to draw a map if one were clever. There were gaps. There were always gaps. Jon watched the last flight go and said nothing, because all the words were folded and sealed and bound under wings. They waited. Nothing is so difficult for a man who has almost died twice in a week as waiting. Jon trained, and the ring of steel on the ward sounded brittle beneath the shudder of the sea. Daenerys watched him sometimes with a face that did not give away her thoughts. He grew wary of those looks and wanted them in the same breath. He walked the roofline and counted the paths the dragons took from tower to sky. He went to the beaches grim with slag and watched 1,000 little wars of wind and tide play out an end. He slept a little. He dreamed not at all or did not remember if he did. He did not know, when the ravens became black specks against the same frowning clouds that had seen them carried off, what words had been said when the bells rang the alarms at distant seats. In White Harbor, the gulls screaming, the cranes creaking on their chains, Lord Wyman Manderley was being fed when Maester Theomore brought an affront into his hall. There was stew of clams and leek, and a pie with a crimped crust that steamed when cut, and cups of beer warming themselves under glazes of foam, and he was laughing because he laughed often when there was food and rarely laughed otherwise. Theomore carried the iron-bound coffer as if it were the head of a saint. "From Dragonstone," the Maester said, "sealed with the sigils of the Dragon Queen and the King in the North." "The King in the North may have my ear," Manderley said thickly. "As for the Dragon Queen, I have had enough of dragons in my time to last me 3 lives. What's in the box?" Theomore swallowed. "They say proof." "Of what?" The coffer answered. An old tapping, a dog scratching at a door. Manderley's laugh died. He waved the servants away and then, abruptly mindful, called back 2 of them to fetch sand and a brazier and a barrel of the river water that sat under the steps. He had sons. Had sons. He had grandchildren, some of them bones and some of them not. "Bring my heir," he said, and men bolted for the doors, knowing not to run in Manderley's presence unless told to run. He opened the box. He saw the hand. It complained against the chain as if it had wrists to turn. It groped at the rim. For a terrible moment, the things it should not have touched crossed his mind. His daughter, whose girl was near, a servant's heel, a boy's trouser leg. He had the brazier plunged and the hand thrust into it, and the stinking smoke drove good men from the hall with their sleeves over their faces. Theomore gagged on the smell and vomited in a corner. The hand struggled until it did not. Even then, Manderley kept it pressed into the coals until no finger rose black to wave the smoke away, and then he drew it out with tongs and dropped it in the sand barrel. The quenching hiss sounded like something relieved. He cleaned his hands and read the letter through twice. Then he took up a quill and wrote his reply with the blunt tenacity of a man carving a path through a drift. When he was done, he stood, and the men who had crept back to watch drew up as if the tides had turned. "Send for the levy," he said. "1/3 to hold White Harbor, 2/3 to march when the King in the North calls. Put salt pork on the road. Buy grain. I want every baker's oven in service, and I want to hear complaints like birdsong. Open every storehouse door and count. Count again. And to the Manderley fleet, what fleet we still have after lions went to cutting. Tell them they will row their fat arms into ropes, because they are going to ferry men until the winter tears their hands. In Bear Island, the ravens made more noise than the sea did. Lyanna Mormont watched her maester, a frightened old man in brown, unwrap something she could have ordered burned without touching. She did not. The girl was made of the island the way the spruce had claws on the rock. She watched the fingerless palm scrabble. She looked at her aunt, who had come home in exile and carried herself apologetic and bruised and held a child on her hip as if the child were the only reason to be alive. "You saw this beyond the wall?" she asked the letter cool. "You swore it with ink when the King in the North swore it with blood." She had the box carried out into the snow and burned without fuss or word said. Then she faced the men, such of them as were left, who had gathered at the shout of the alarm. "We declared Jon Snow our king because he told us a truth no one else would," she said, and her young voice did not carry like a storm or a bell. It carried because she had never bothered to make herself small. "Now he sends proof. We'll not sleep on the island like bears in a den. We'll wake sharp and be where we must be. Gather what wood is left. We will go." No one doubted her. The island had stood alone often enough to know a command when it heard one. In the eyrie, the air was thin and keen. Men argued there because the space encouraged it, their breaths ghosting in front of their faces like corals loosed. Jon Royce had the box set on a flagstone and had the stone heated before he undid the chain. When the hand flung itself, he brought his boot down on it. He watched the fingers claw at the hide sole and felt nothing but hard, unnatural tenacity. He pried it free with the tip of a dagger and dropped it into a brazier. The flames shrank back as if offended. Royce stood until the master-at-arms threatened to drag him away from the smoke. When his eyes watered less, he said, "To your letters, my lords." And the men who fancied themselves the voices of the Vale stopped arguing about winter and began to write or to sign and put their seals to the words they had never imagined they would commit their names to. At Horn Hill, the castellan knew the sigils on the wax and thought very carefully about keeping the thing, because men who served lions thought often about treasures and how to turn them. He opened the box. The smell turned his stomach. The thing scuttled. He slapped the lid on and sent for a torch. Later, when he wrote his answer, it was a careful thing, long and formal, that pledged respect and neutrality and promised nothing. But men in the barracks spoke none of the castellan's tongue when they told each other what the box had held. Men in the fields took sick when they thought on it. Horn Hill had been a house of hunters. Hunters trust their senses. The castellan could dismiss letters, but he could not dismiss a finger that tried to climb his leg as if it sought the high ground of his belt. In Dorne, men brought the coffer to a lord who wore no sigil because no one could put a name to who ruled Dorne now. The martels were ash scattered on water, the sand snakes a tale told to make boys think on knives. The man who broke the wax had been a steward before he was anything else, and he had seen vineyards wither and orchards rot and men take their spears north to fight lions and not come back. He had not seen a dead hand seek out the air. He had it burned and then called messengers. By the time the sun leaked out over the red stone, word had gone through enough house courtyards that the small folk muttered of white worms that walked when cut. Men who had sworn never to march for lords again put their spearheads on and peered north as if they could see past mountains. In Old Town, the Raven Wall was a sheet of black snow from the birds that had not rested. The stairways crowded with boys in chain and men who would be men one day. Archmaester Ibroz came to the rookery in irritation and left in thought. He and 3 of his brothers and 2 younger men, who burned with ambition, opened their offering in a circle with sand readied and the cage for a hawk prepared again. The hand made even the man who had cut open dead men for study step back. He wrote that night, Ibroz did, in a plain book, his letters small and exact, and his words were everything a man who had sent Samwell Tarly away would need to eat. He had no appetite for his meal. By morning, the ravens were being kept for work no one had named yet, because the conclave needed them and needed them now and said so aloud in a chamber where the lamps burned day long. In King's Landing, Qyburn sniffed the air like a dog that scents a kitchen's secrets and smiled into his beard. He broke the seal as if it were a trinket sent to him, and showed the thing to Cersei with hands that did not tremble. He did it in her solar, the window slit, the light on a cloth made with a small stitch by S. Long dead lady who had understood that the eye falls to detail. The hand chattered at the edge until Qyburn held it by the chain as if he had let a child into the room, and then, obliging, he set it on the board that held her wine, so that it pawed at the bottom of her cup and left damp smears when it could not grip it. Cersei's face did not change. Her knuckles had gone white on a chair arm once when she had seen a head lifted by the hair, and no one had marked it save the man who lifted it. She watched the hand and drank. "And?" she asked. "An explanation," Qyburn said, almost tender. "An answer to why the beasts in the north do not die when you cut them. The movement persists. A scholar might say the animating force does not reside in a single organ. You have been waiting all your life for a puzzle to put your fingers in," she said, and Euron, who had come unannounced and sprawled in a chair with his boots on her floor, laughed at that. A sound like a keel scraping rock. Jaime stood like a piece of furniture that remembered being a man. The mountain breathed, a bellows somewhere behind his visor. Cersei's smile did not reach her eyes. They were fixed not on the twitching thing, but on the seal in wax on the double mark of dragon and wolf. "A trick," she said. "Of a sort," Qyburn said. "A trick of winter." "Burn it," she said. He did, and watched it burn with love. "It is real, your grace," he said softly, when the smoke was only a taste in her throat and the ash was being swept away by a serving girl who stared at the gray-black smeared on her broom as if she would not scrub her hands clean again. "But everything real can be used. I am not certain yet how, but this—" He did not finish. He did not have to. He had spoken enough to a woman who had sent wildfire through rank upon rank of men. The word use opened her as if he had put a key in a lock. Later that day, a gold cloak named Derry told a wharfside whore that the queen had a dead man's hand at her supper, and that it had tried to take the cup from her like a child trying to pull a sweep. By nightfall, the tail had swollen and sprouted a tongue and teeth. It spoke of the dead knocking on the gates of the city and of children who wandered in the alleys with eyes old and white. Flea-bottom swelled tails the way yeast swelled dough, warm, fast, ready to be pinched into loaves and fed to anyone hungry to be afraid. Men who loved the queen for being hard told themselves that their queen would be harder than winter. Men who did not love the queen whispered that the dead would be just as hard for her as she had been for them. Somewhere, a priest of the red god set a corner of his robe alight and waved it in the street as he cried of night and fire, and a baker slapped him about the head for frightening his daughter, and the daughter went home and dreamed of ice with a tongue. On the silence, Euron Greyjoy dangled a jaw from a length of chain and made it chatter for sailors who had seen worse things in the Ironborn way and did not like the way their bellies turned at the sound of it. He left it on a hook where it clicked to the rhythm of the ship's roll. He grinned when one of his men crossed himself in a way that was not of the drowned god. "See," he said, "the North spits out toys now. The world grows interesting." He decided, with the dear heart of a man for whom every river and sea was an avenue to take, that interesting need not change anything he had already chosen. He would go to the Dragonpit. He would grin at men and make them squirm. He would leave when he wished and make a flourish of it. But the jaw on the hook clicked like a bad conscience, and twice in the night he got up and rattled it and laughed to hear the sound it made as if the ship itself had teeth. On a road through the Crownlands, Brienne of Tarth rode hard for King's Landing with the wind under her jaw and the vow that always burned her tongue. As if she had swallowed some of that fire, the red priest slopped about. She stopped for bread at a crofter's hut, and the woman there would not take coin when Brienne set the crowned stag on the table because she had heard a tale of the dead walking, and did not think coin would be worth anything when winter came with teeth. Brienne slept with her sword within her hand that night, not because of fear of the dead, but because men looked at her and wanted to take what they thought a woman could not keep. She dreamed of Cat Stone Lady, of the woman who had been and had not been, and of the eyes that had been wrong. She woke with her jaw tight and found that her hand had clenched around Oathkeeper, so that the ridges of the hilt had set prints in her palm. Oathkeeper felt warm still, steadied her. In Winterfell, Sansa read the copies of the letters that had been sent and had not been sent, and made her own. She wrote to men Jon would not think to speak to, men who had tried to hedge by waiting, to women who governed under their husbands' names without anyone naming the fact, to old dowagers who would not fight themselves but who held the keys to larders. She called on old kinship and older debts. She sent one to a name she did not speak aloud, Littlefinger's old man in Gulltown who had traded favors for secrets, because a debt could be turned twice and still ring sound. She did not sleep much and gave no one the small pride of seeing her eyes ringed. Arya came and went like a small wind that rattled shutters and did not budge doors. Bran sat still in rooms he had liked as a boy and looked through walls that had not been meant to be seen through so often. Sansa loved her brothers in ways that made her feel foolish when she remembered what she had thought love was. She drew lines on maps and had the yard cleared of snow and measured grain with a patience that was not a lady's virtue but a castellan's, and did not say the word fear aloud though it walked with her. The replies came to Dragonstone like the sea. One crash, and then the suck, and then another crash. Some were words on paper, some were stacks of salted pork, some were grumbled acceptance at a door. Men sent coin because coin could be packed into a box. Men sent sheep because sheep bleated and could be counted, and the men who sent them liked to count what was alive after men had been dead in their houses. There were refusals. There were always refusals. There were careful letters from men who had served the throne all their lives and would not cease now because winter had decided to have a taste of them. There were letters that did not pretend to respect. Jon did not throw them in the fire. He read each one, and then he set them aside as if they were a stack of winter's bills. Daenerys came to the rookery at dusk the day Varys brought the letter from King's Landing that was written in a precise, careful hand and bore the lion seal heavy enough to bite the wax. She stood near the window where the cold made her hair lift at the ends and held her palms together as if she were about to pray and had forgotten who to pray to. "Cersei invites us," she said. "It will be held in the Dragonpit." "She does not invite," Tyrion said. "She conjures." But the words are correct, and they are words written for other eyes, which means she thinks it will do her good to appear to have written them. His eyes were narrowed, but he was smiling in a way that made Jon trust him and not trust the smile. "The courtiers will be there. The lords will fill the stands as if they have a tourney to watch. She wants a theater." "She will have one," Daenerys said. "So will we." She looked at Jon. "You sent pieces to her city. She will not be surprised." "She will still be what she is," Jon said. "The dead don't make the living into anything they weren't already. The dead don't choose." Daenerys tilted her head as if the idea were a coin she had not been given as a child. "Then we'll choose," she said. "We'll choose to make the living see." The hound grumbled when he was handed the cage with the whole of it inside. "You lot ever learn?" He asked no one in particular, and the thing clawed and tore at the lattice as if it had the memory of the courtyard and had been waiting to do that again. It bit the bars until 2 of its teeth chipped. The hound snarled back, because snarling was a language men had taught him and he could not unlearn it. He carried the cage as if it were the head of an enemy and not a symbol. He did not like symbols. He liked clean blows. "We will go," Daenerys said to Jon as the ships were being readied. Men pried old weed from the seams and sealed them again. The dragons cried in the sky as if stung. Jon watched their wings beat and felt that familiar pull beneath his ribs, the one that had become worse since he had clawed light out of water that wanted to take him and everything he was. Daenerys looked at him in a way that warmed and frightened him at once, because warmth could be used as a weapon and had been against him, and he had wielded it too without meaning to. "And we will come back," she said. He did not know if she swore it for the men who stood near or for herself. He took it anyway and nodded. He had learned in the north that men made themselves go by saying that they would. They sailed under sky that looked bruised. The sea moved like a beast that had remembered all at once that it had a spine. The ships kept their distance from the black cliffs where fisherfolk clung to lives the way barnacles clung to hulls. Men in those boats paused with their nets dripping and watched the white-capped fleet go and cross themselves, some to 7 gods and some to 1 and some to none at all, and only to the superstition that the sea be kind. The wind stayed with them. For once, wind did not play sides. It moved men as if all of them had the same will. When the walls of King's Landing rose from the smear of horizon to the stubbornness of stone, the fleet did not sound its presence with any flourish. No one would be impressed. Smoke lay over the city even without fires, a gray that had become a season, the smell of shit and baking bread and horse sweat and the stink of men living too near one another. The gold cloaks stood in ranks that looked careful. The small folk stood where they were not meant to stand and watched, because people always watched when the world threatened to become a tale instead of a grind. There were more banners than Tyrion had thought, and he said as much to Varys, who stood, as always, a half step in the shadow of another man's face. "She invited the realm to a play," Tyrion said. "She got one. The letters did it. The pieces did it." He did not smile. He did not like plays in which the ending could be guessed but the actors had not yet given in to it. "Fear sent letters where we could not," Varys said. Bronn stood with the Sellsword stance of a man who had watched too many men die to be impressed by dead men moving. And, clustered where they had no right to be and every right, the envoys from elsewhere in the realm. Graying Lord of the Vale with a pin of bronze, a man from the Reach rich with fat rings, who could not stop looking at the places where the old cages had been. A woman in a rough wool cloak with a pin that said Tarth. 2 men in desert colors who stood under a banner without any emblem on it at all. A trio of minor lords from the Riverlands who had a family resemblance of suspicion, and more. They had come to see. They swore later that they had come to listen, but men always claim to have done the noble thing. Brienne saw Jaime and stiffened a little and put her jaw back into the place where it belonged. The hound took his place and dropped the cage a little harder than he needed to. The thing inside answered with a Homer's thump. The air in the Dragonpit shifted. A bird called high above, and the sound hung, and then was gone. Tyrion opened his mouth to speak, to shape all of the careful arguments he had written and rehearsed and thrown away and written again. Then Jon stepped forward, because Jon often accepted the hard thing first, as if to get it out of the way of other men. "You received our letters," he said, loud enough for the pit to hear, and let the word letters be all it could be. "You saw what we sent. Some of you burned it. Some of you kept it a night and listened to it on your tables and did not sleep. Some of you sent your men to burn it because your hands shook. We brought it here anyway. I won't argue with you about what's coming. I'll show you." Cersei's mouth curved the way a knife's edge curves when it has been honed until the steel is thin. "Begin the show," she said. Euron laughed to hear it. Jaime did not. The hound unlatched the cage. The latch looked small. Hands that had killed men with maces and axes moved delicately over it. The wooden slats lifted. Snow had a smell even in a city like this, even when there was no snow to be seen. Cold breathed up. The wight came out as if the ground were an enemy. It clawed and crawled and scrambled and hauled itself up with all the mindless desire it had and no more. It hit the short distance between it and Cersei as if thrown. The chain that had been slipped to it at the last moment checked it. It strained. A man near the back screamed like a goat. Qyburn leaned forward as if he might catch the thing when it fell. Cersei held her ground. Jaime did not move for a space, and then, when the chain jerked and the wight's fingers flicked, just short of the hem of his sister's skirts, he stepped in, sword half-bared. The mountain's gauntlet twitched. Euron made a show of stepping back and then laughed at himself as if to say he had not meant to do it. Brienne flinched without moving. Somewhere high up, the Reach Lord's mouth had gone thin. Jon did what he always did. He acted as if the world were simple and hard, and if you moved your hands, it would be less hard. He stepped in, and as he had at Eastwatch and in a courtyard with broken flags, he took a dragonglass dagger from his belt and brought it up under the wight's jaw and into its brain, if brain it could be called. It did not stop. He cut its arm off. The arm scrabbled on the ground and tried to climb his boot. He seized the writhing thing and threw it to the feet of the men who wore silk and gold. He cut off a leg. He severed thumb and finger. He wished he had something holier than a brazier, but he had fire. Davos thrust a torch. Jon burned the pieces one by one, calling for more when the flame dulled. The scent of burned linen and old meat rolled out in a wave that broke on the stands and made men gag into their sleeves and women press kerchiefs to their mouths. He kept moving because he had learned there are tasks that only resolve if you keep doing them. Took longer than it should have. The dead are stubborn. When it was done, the ash lay in a scatter that did not look like anything that had ever been a man. Jon panted, watching the last scrap curl. Davos stepped in and grounded the torch, leaning on it as if he were a man who had walked too far and had little left. There was a silence that had nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with fear. Weighed, accounted for, and then put on ledgers everyone in the pit would carry with them thereafter. Cersei looked at Jon for a long time, then at Daenerys, who had come in not on the back of a dragon but on a litter like a queen who could walk and had chosen not to. Cersei's mouth thinned at that. She did not like anyone else's theater. The little move of her head when she looked back to Tyrion might have been respect. It might have been recognition. She had eaten too many lies to be surprised by truth. "This is real," she said. Euron made a noise, as if about to argue for the fun of it. She lifted a hand. He stopped. "We'll help you. We'll send our armies north." Jaime turned his head as if the words hurt. Tyrion's face stayed still. Then Euron laughed and shouted to the pit that he would go home, because the dead could not swim. He left the way men leave when they want to be seen leaving. A few in the stands rose, uncertain, and then sat again when it became clear no one would stop him with steel. What was there to do? A man's choice is his own. There were no ravens in the Dragonpit to carry what was said there. There didn't need to be. There were men and women with ears and tongues and eyes, and that was worse. The envoys made their own little theaters in the city that night, at inns in the safelier parts and in attics near the river where coin greased doors. They told what they had seen and did not tell what they had not understood. In the morning, when the queen told her brother in a dark room that she had lied in light, told him she would not send her men, not when she needed them to hold the city that was hers, Jaime stood dumb as a bell before the strike, and then the strike fell. "You saw it," he said. "You saw what the hand did to the coals and what it did not. You heard it. I heard fear, sirs.
A sight.
I used it. It's not a thing to use," he said, and it was the closest he had come in years to praying to something. Qyburn hovered like a moth over a candle it does not quite dare touch. "Your Grace," he said. "When I held the thing in my hand, I felt its nature. If they can be made." "Can they?" she asked. "Made." A glint that Jaime had loved once, that had cut his fingers, lit in her face. Qyburn shrugged, an admission and a claim in the same movement. "We could lure them," Jaime said, hoarse, because he had no better words. "And then what? Then you show your men how to fight them and send them south after and pray they remember the lesson wrong? This isn't a war we can win with coins and lies." "No war is won without both," Cersei said. "Go if you must. Go be a hero for winter. I will be a queen for what comes after." She lifted her cup and drank the wine that had been poured. Jaime watched the dark red tug itself along the rim and thought of blood pulled up into a goblet by gravity. He left. He left because he had to. The snow when he rode out lay on the ground like a thought with no words to name it. He hunched in his cloak and watched the city fall away and did not look back. His horse's breath steamed. He could not remember the last time he had been cold like this. When flakes found his cheek, he wiped them away and told himself it was only to see the road. He headed north and did not know yet if he rode to his death or to the ruin of all men. The difference had stopped mattering somewhere between a hand clawing at his sister's table and the taste of refusal in the back of his throat. In the city it snowed. Children came out into alleys with eyes bright and lifted their tongues to the sky. A man set a basin in a courtyard and marveled to find clean water when the snow in it melted. He had not seen such a thing since he was a boy in the Riverlands and had stolen a priest's jug because it smelled of mint. A whore laughed and let it fill her hair. A baker stepped off his step to listen to the sound the flakes made when they struck the stones. It was a small sound. It would get bigger. That night, as Daenerys and Jon stood on a balcony that had seen storms in 3 kings' reigns and fires in 2, the world felt oddly quiet. The city slept with one eye open. The dragons slept uncomfortably, turning and turning as if they chased their own tails in their dreams. "We did what we could," she said. "The letters, the proof. It will have moved some," Jon said. He looked out over roofs. He did not know which roof belonged to a friend and which to a foe. Men's roofs are always one or the other. "Not enough. That's the only answer there ever is," she said, but her voice made it sound like a comfort. "Never enough. And we go anyway." They saw. The ones who needed to see saw. The ones who did not never would have. "I lied only once," Jon said. A thought plucked from its nest in his head and shone to the cold air. She looked at him and he shook his head. "Not here. Not about this. I told her I'd sworn to you. It was the truth. That cost us a pledge, and I don't know if it gained us one. That truth weighed one way," she said slowly. "Lies weigh another. I cannot count what men keep when they count only the lies they told that day. But I saw the mountain of their fear. It is higher than their walls." He turned and found her close because she was a woman who stepped near when men turned away. He had done the same in another life. She lifted a hand, barely, and then dropped it. "We will go north," he said. "We will," she said. The spider, in another room, set out little carved stones on a map, the kind of thing that would make a lesser man feel clever, and then swept 2 of the pieces off the board and into his hand and held them there. No one saw. He thought of them as lives. He sent 2 boys to the bakehouses with messages he had no need to commit to paper. He fed the birds that had not flown and would not fly again. Men who love information love to own its pathways. He had long since learned to love mending them. They were broken often. The world broke them, and men broke them, and birds died. He tied a string and made it whole again. In Winterfell, Sansa read that Cersei had promised men and sent none, and smiled without humor because she had told herself she would not err in trusting a woman who had burned a church full of her enemies. She sent more messages. She moved grain from one village to another, and men grumbled and then grumbled less when they ate soup that night. Arya came out of the God's Wood with snow in her hair and a look like a blade catching far light. "She lies as easily as we breathe," Arya said. Sansa did not smile. "So do we," she said, and the words tasted like tin. "When we have to." "All right," Arya said, "because a spear that bends without breaking is not less a spear." She twirled her knife absently, catching the blade and not cutting herself. Brienne found Sansa the day the white knife froze along its edges. She did not speak of Jaime. She did not need to. Sansa saw it there, the way a woman sees the absence of a ring on a hand that has grown used to it. "We'll need you," Sansa said. "We'll need you to stand between us and what we cannot stop." "I will," Brienne said simply. Her hand rested on Oathkeeper, and for a moment neither woman looked away from the bright steel just visible where it peered from scabbard. It had been red once. It would be red again. In Old Town, men argued decorously over candles. One stood and said they would send maesters north to study the phenomenon. Another said they would send carts of dragonglass if such a thing could be found this far south, which it could not. Ebrose listened and felt the year grow heavy in his bones. A boy who had wanted to be a man stood and said that perhaps they should speak to the Red Priests, that now was not a moment to hold old grudges against new gods. Another man laughed at him. The argument clicked and rattled and would not settle. Ebrose rose when he was certain his standing would stop it. "Send men who can write," he said. "Send men who can count. Send letters to lords whose maesters know the names of the past winters and have forgotten what snow feels like. And write, all of you. Write to the families who kiss where their boys' heads once were. Apologize. It won't matter to the dead, but the living will need the words." When he sat, there was a moment in which the room remembered how old he was. The ravens took to the air again, carrying different words this time. Promises were a currency. When the birds returned to roost on towers white with frost, their beaks were rimed with ice. Jon watched from the wall walk on the eastern curtain as a pair came down to the rookery. He wondered where they had flown, what winter had looked like in the eyes of the men who'd seen their bellies when they dipped for a landing. He wondered whether the dead noticed birds. He thought they did not. When they marched out of King's Landing, those who left, they left under an honest sky, bright and brittle. The banners they carried were smaller than they had been at other times, because men had learned that large banners are good targets in bad weather. The men who rode under them tried to make themselves bigger to make up for it. Some failed. Jaime, riding north with less than he'd hoped and more than he'd expected, looked back only once. He saw the city as a toy a child had smashed. He saw the snow smear itself along roofs. He saw the river look sluggish, as if it were a man with a fever. He turned his head away and pushed his horse and decided that, if he was to die, he would die doing a thing with no good name and no good prize. Felt like a relief. Men had put names on him since he was 15. He could be nameless at the end and feel richer for it. On Dragonstone, the Dragon Queen sat a little while in the chamber with the map table and let her hand move along the carved river lines as if they were powers she could call. Firelight turned the ridges into hills. She had known fire as a friend and an enemy. She had known counsel as comfort and as chain. She thought not of thrones, though she thought of thrones often and with an appetite she did not deny, but of steps on a stair, each step rising into cold. Jon came and did not hesitate to come nearer than a courtier would have come. He smelled of steel and salt and the clean bit of cold. She had never much liked the smell of cold when she was a girl. It had been a thing outside walls, a thing that dripped through cracks, a thing that meant her brother's temper would be worse. Here now it smelled like purpose. He said without prelude, "It worked. Enough." She smiled in the way of a woman who knows her teeth have been seen and has chosen to put her lips over them. "It worked," she said. "Enough." She looked at the black beyond the window. The sea did not glint. It only was. "We'll go," she said again. The same words she had spoken on the balcony. The same words she had spoken in herself when men had expected different words. "We'll go where I was never taken as a girl, but where I will go as a woman. We'll go to where your vows were made." "And broken," Jon said. "And remade," she said. He bowed his head and let the smallest smile touch the corner of his mouth. The smile of a man who had learned that some things can be made new and last long enough to matter. When they rode north, the sound of their passing was not glory. It was the sound of iron on iron, of men coughing, of horses' shoes on ground that would soon be stone. The road was not theirs alone. From the Vale men came, glittering even under the gray. From White Harbor came bearded men in furs who carried their food with them and did not trust strangers to feed them. From Tarth came a small, tight knot of men and one tall woman who might have been half a man to those who did not know her and was twice a man to those who had watched her fight. From the Riverlands came men who looked like they had been hungry for too long and had decided not to be hungry anymore. They all looked up when a shadow crossed the ground and a dragon made the daylight seem brighter in its passing. They changed the innyards of the realm on their way. A boy who had never seen a dragon cried and then laughed in the same breath. A girl who had made cakes since she was 6 stood and watched as if the oven door had opened on a world she had not known she had baked in. A man who had learned to hate this queen because of the stories that had been ladled into his ear found that an actual woman on a horse could be hated less easily. A priest who had preached of mercy bit his lip when one of the Northmen took a barley loaf without asking. He did not speak. He was not a fool. Letters continued to fly, back and forth. Some had been sent too late and found halls empty, fires banked, only a dog to bark at the door. Some found men on the road and made them prudent or rash. Some got wet and blurred and carried their meaning in a smear and a seal. Tyrion read everyone he could and kept a ledger in his head that no one else could see. He ticked off allies and counted enemies as if he kept a tavern's book and knew which men drank and never paid and which men paid in advance and never drank. He slept little. He did not drink more. He had learned not to. He remembered his father's mouth when the word disappointment had been carved under his teeth. He smiled at the snow sometimes and wondered if it would muffle everything or sharpen it. North of the neck, where the winter had bite and not just breath, where pines held snow in their splayed hands and rocks wore white caps like a joke, Jon's men found a farmhouse with doors swinging in the wind. The hearth was cold. The beds were not made. In the barn, a cow stood in a place that should have held more cows. Her breath fogged and warmed the space around her. He tossed her head and showed white of eye. When they went into the copse beyond the barn, the tracks they followed were wrong. Jon knelt and looked and said nothing. The men behind him shifted, and steel made small noises. When they began to cut branches for a pyre, they kept their faces set like men in prayer. No one called for a septon. There was work. They did it. The pyre burned with a green hiss at the edge of it, because someone in that house had had a little cask of lye and it had spilled when the chest was overturned. Jon watched until it was only ash. Davos stood with him and said, "This is the proof no one wanted." And Jon nodded once, because a man who had already stopped a hand with a torch has no more words to offer on the matter. When they came to Winterfell at last, the walls looked both like home and like a place that had become too important to be called home. The yard was full. The eyes were many. Sansa stood at the top of the steps because she had learned to stand where men would see her. Arya stood at her shoulder as if she had been born there and had simply gone away for a while to remember it. Bran sat near, his wolf eyes looking past the coming and the going. He tilted his head when Daenerys came within his sight. She felt the weight of his gaze as if an old tree had leaned toward her. There were greetings. There was careful courtesy. There was the little dance of power that men pretend not to do when the men they are dancing with are allies. There were embraces and few of them false. It would have been a beautiful day if the sky had not been the color of old iron and the air not cold enough to make the inside of a nose sting. They called council in the great hall. because there was nowhere else to fit so many people who needed to speak and who should, if the world made sense, spend their time suitably in silence making plans and doing work. But men speak. They always speak. Wyman Manderley spoke like a cask being rolled. Yon Royce spoke like a sword striking a shield. Lady Mormont spoke like an axe's flat hit hard on a stump when a man has missed the log. Brienne spoke rarely, and when she did, the words fell square. Tyrion spoke often and made men nod who had come prepared to find him oily. Davos spoke in plain sentences that stuck because truth likes plainness. Even the men from Dorne spoke, though they said little and what they said was cautious. Daenerys spoke, and some men looked as if they had touched the bowl of a candle and found that it would not burn them but might. Jon did not speak until the talking had slumped a little, like a fire that has eaten the best of the wood. Then he spoke and said things the others had said already but made them listen again because he spoke like a man who had stood where he had said he had stood. His eyes from time to time met Daenerys's, and he did not look away when they did. Bran spoke once. He said, "They are near," and a draft trickled down the hall as if the ghosts of men's breath had turned around to listen. He did not say how he knew. He never did. Sansa put a hand on the back of his chair, as if she could keep him in the room by touching wood that he touched. Arya watched him with the concentration of a cat watching a child. They made plans, the sort men have made every time winter has come with hunger and enemies. Scouts, pickets, lines of retreat, lines of fire, signals, stores. Who would be the first to bend and who the last to break? Who would hold the gates and who would sally? Because men like that word for what is only opening a door and knowing you will close it with fewer men than you had. Daenerys pointed to places on the carved table when the map was moved from Dragonstone to the Lord Solar. The dragons would strike here and then here. Jon would be there. Others began to place their markers near where he had set his. No one said they sat under his shadow. They did anyway. That night, when the hall had been cleared and only the smoke remained, and the sound of a few men snoring rose from corners where they had sunk down exhausted, Jon stood in the godswood. The heart tree's face was a wound that had dried and scarred. He looked at it as if he could look through it. His breath smoked and then was gone. He was a man bringing women and men to a place where they would die. He was a man making a world, though, if he could. He did not speak a prayer aloud. He did not know if anyone listened, not to words. Daenerys came into the gods with the way a woman who reveres nothing would come into a place men said was holy. Respectfully, as if she respected that they believed. She watched the white bark and wondered if, under the red eyes, there had been a girl once who had loved a man for what he could do with a sword and not for the kingdom he could win. She stepped close to Jon, but not too close. The cold fell on her hair and pearled it, and she broke away the crystals with her fingertips as if she had been born in the north and not overseas where salt and sun were the things that planted themselves on a woman's skin. "I will not say that the proof we sent made this easy," she said. "It did not. It made it possible," he said. "Yes," she said, "and that might be all we ever get. Possible." He looked at her, and the gods would held its breath. The wind did not move. Somewhere beyond the wall, Ghost's paws made prints that filled with blown white, and then the prints filled with darkness again. "That's enough," Jon said. He meant it. He meant it enough to make it true for a moment, in the way that men sometimes do when they throw truth down hard and it breaks through the crust of things. "That's enough," he said again, and then, because the world had taught him that sometimes a man gets to say a thing and it matters, he took her hand, for a moment, there in a northern wood under a face carved by men who believed bones remember. The dead did not care. They came. They came with footfalls that made no sound. Hat could be told to a man who had not heard it. They came with the awful will of ice and memory that had been stripped of meaning. They did not know that men had sent letters to one another. They did not know that a hand had clawed a queen's table and left marks that would never be scraped out. They did not know that in a city far to the south, a lion queen had put fear on a scale and found a measure she could pour. They did not know that a knight with hair as gold as his shame had ridden away from warmth into cold. They came, and the men who had received the proofs came too. Not all. Enough. They came with a stubbornness that had made the realm survivable for as long as it had. The Veil's lines held longer than Jon had thought they would, shields tight, the air in front of them full of breaths they could see. Manderley's men moved like a tide out and in around a rock. The Bear Islanders fought under a banner that was too big and did not sag. The Dornish held the left when the cold found them and did not make them sit down and cry like children, which many men would have done. The men from the Reach fell more often than they should have, and the ones who did not fall stood more stubbornly because of those who had. It was not enough because it could not be, because no thing is ever enough against a tide when you hold only other men to your chest and try to keep them from floating away. But it was enough to make a line of fire where a line would not have been. It was enough to make the dragon's heat a thing that was not lonely in the sky. It was enough to make men look left and right and see a man who spoke differently standing there and think, "He is with me." As for Cersei, she did not sleep well that winter. She woke at a noise she had never heard before, and when she asked Qyburn later to describe the sound of freezing bones on stone, he did his best and saw that she was not listening. She drank the best wine she could put in her hands and ate little, because the taste of ash did not leave her mouth. She said the words a queen says, and men did what they were told to do. She stared into the brazier often. She dreamed of a hand, blackened and still. In the dream, it found the cup and took it away from her. She woke thirsty. Jaime, on a field where the snow-crusted glittered like cheap jewels, cut down something that had once been a farmer and then something that had once been a boy. He did not apologize to either. He had apologized too often in his head. He put his shoulder to a shield and shoved and felt a man next to him shove back and grin at him, and he realized, dimly and then sharply, that the proof that had scuttled across a baked queen's table had not only taught him fear, it had taught him to be with men again. He laughed into the cold and then choked on it and kept fighting. Tyrion stood on the wall at Winterfell and watched the approach as men do who cannot help where their weight will fall in the world. He remembered that some letters had been read by men who had folded them and set them aside and had gone out to their coursers and shouted for their men and not told them what they had just read. He remembered that some hands had poured letters into the fire and then had sat in front of the hearth late into the night, warming themselves on a heat they did not need because fear had made them cold. He remembered the fat Reach Lord who had held himself with dignity until the hand had started to move. He remembered the way Qyburn's fingers had rested lightly on the chain, gentle with the thing in a way he had never seen the man be gentle with anything alive. Davos counted the torches along the ridge and counted again. The numbers did not change. He did not speak. He touched the fingers he had left on his right hand to the hilt of the knife he carried and tried not to think of the missing ones. He wondered if the dead could smell salt. He wondered if the dead would be offended by the smell of onions. He smiled, and in the dark that smile was an act of rebellion. Sansa walked the battlements with a cloak pulled tight and gave orders like loaves she sliced from a larger loaf. Enough to fill a man's mouth, enough to remember the bread was still there. Brienne shadowed her, and men who had planned to ignore a woman's voice found their mouths answering before their minds had formed the defiance, because the voice had the right shape. Arya went where she pleased and returned with blood on her, and a look like a woman who had run down a deer alone. She wiped her knife clean on snow and then wiped the snow off on her sleeve and smiled without teeth when she saw Sansa watching her. And Sansa smiled back with teeth because both kinds of smiles have their place. Daenerys rode a dragon into a sky that had gone white and gray at once and breathed heat into a world that wanted to be only cold. She had never been so afraid. She had never been so alive. She saw Jon on the ground, small as a man must be strange to a woman in the sky, and wanted to take him up and put him where nothing could touch him, which is a childish desire and no less strong for it. She turned the dragon where he pointed and did not think of thrones while she burned men who had once been men and could only be burned now. The dragon screamed because the sky hurt its lungs. She screamed because the world hurt hers. Jon lifted his sword and brought it down and lifted it and brought it down. He did not count. He did not pray. He did not plan the next day or the day after. He only stood where he was and kept men from moving past him to where the heartbeats were that he loved and would not see stopped if his arms still had strength. He thought once, in the space between the killing and the next killing, that a hand had tapped on the wood of a table far south and that someone had listened. He did not have time to think it again. when the day turned toward night and then toward day again with no light to mark the difference. Ce, men fell where they stood and other men stepped into their places. That is all the proof of anything a realm ever needs. When it broke, as it would always break, it did not shatter in every place. There are always ledges on cliffs where men catch themselves, knuckles white, heels digging. The letters, the pieces of moving things, the fear that had flown on black wings in winter, they had given the ledges names. Men went to them because men go to places that have been named. Later, when songs were written by people who would never have believed what they sang if they had not been told the proofs, they said it had been a cunning plan. They said Jon Snow had sent bits of the dead to drum fear into living hearts. It made him sound cruel. It made him sound clever. In truth, he had sent what he had. The only thing men would believe because they could put it on their tables and watch it move and then put it in the fire and watch it die. He did not think often in later days about that choice, because the world gave him less time for thinking than he might have liked. When he did think of it, he did not regret it. He regretted different things. In a city by the sea, where the air still smelled of rotten wine and peppers and the tang of the black water, a queen sat awake and watched the last of a torch go out and wished that when she closed her eyes, she would hear only the ordinary sounds of a palace at night. She put her hand on her belly as if that would change the shape of what was inside or of what was outside. When she did sleep, a hand crawled in her dreams and stole her cup again. When she woke, her tongue was dry. In the end, winter tells us nothing new. It only says the old things loudly. Men had always known how to fear. Men had always known how to gather. Jon had not made them know either. He had only pressed his hand to something that should not have moved and then put it into a box and then told a bird to go. He had hoped. He had not prayed. He had opened a thing in front of people and watched them flinch and then watched them stand. It was enough. It was not enough. It was what they had. And when the dead came on a night so clear the stars seemed cruel, when the line buckled and then held and then buckled again, when a man with a golden hand slid in blood and got to his feet and a girl with a thin sword stuck it where it mattered and a woman in black on a dragon breathed fire that made the snow hiss, when the proof that had gone everywhere could no longer be denied by anyone, even men who had made a life of denial, then the world was only what it had been turned into by the choices men and women had made before that night. Ravens roost with their heads under their wings in towers across the realm, their bellies full of grain and their feathers full of smoke. In a rookery that smelled of guano and old soot, a maester held a feather and did not write because there were no words for the moment when a thing only you have seen becomes a thing everyone sees. He sat and listened to the wind. He sat and waited to learn if there would be dawn. He sat, and when the first weak light found the stones, he went to his table and began a new page.